This is a weaken question, so we want to make the conclusion less likely, usually by attacking an assumption, though sometimes we bring in new evidence or independent grounds that undermine the conclusion. We're also on the hunt for causal relationships. If we have a causal conclusion, there is a stock set of methods that we can use to weaken that conclusion. And so this one isn't really causal, though. Instead, the conclusion is that consuming meat is soon going to be morally unacceptable because we're running out of stuff or our population is rapidly expanding. And it sounds like meat is not super efficient. So when you make meat from grain, a pound of meat requires 16 pounds of grain. And that pound of meat is going to be more nutritious, but the 16 pounds of grain can feed far more people. And so there's an assumption happening here between that term and this term. We're assuming that if you choose to feed fewer people, that you're doing something that is morally unacceptable. And then there's also this problem where we're only talking about meat from grain, but down at the bottom we're talking about all meat. And so we're sort of assuming that there's no other way to make meat. Like what if you're fishing, or what if you're just like hunting for wild animals and you're not feeding them grain? And so I see two assumptions here. One is that there's no other way to produce meat, that all meat comes from being fed grain, and that if you're doing an action that reduces the number of people that you can feed, that is morally unacceptable. And we could weaken this argument by attacking either of those assumptions. Let's check out the answer choices. A says lots of people like meat and are willing to pay for it, but that doesn't mean that it is a morally okay choice. The whole point here is that eating meat is morally unacceptable. We're not saying it's impossible or that it's not feasible. That's kind of what A would be arguing against. This only argues against an argument that says, therefore you won't be able to get meat. And this says kind of, yeah, I will. I'm willing to pay for it and I like it, so I'll continue to buy it. But that doesn't address whether or not it's moral or not. And so A is out of scope. The question isn't whether you can do it, the question is whether it's moral, because when you eat meat, according to the argument, if you're eating meat from grain, you're essentially taking grain off of somebody else's plate. So B says often cattle or sheep can be raised to maturity on grass that's not suitable for any other kind of farming. And so here, there's no opportunity cost. You're not taking food off of someone else's plate because this land wouldn't be doing anything anyway. This is like free meat, ethically speaking. And so answer choice B is the one that weakens the argument. Specifically, it attacks this assumption that there's no other way to produce meat. We went from talking about meat that comes from grain to all meat in general, and B points out that there are other ways to get meat. And so that's how it does its damage, but let's talk about why C, D, and E aren't damaging. C says if your grain diet is supplemented with protein from not animal sources, it can be healthy. It can be as healthy as a diet that has meat in it. Well, that just makes it sound like this is feasible health-wise, which means that you can do without meat. And so that means that maybe it's morally unethical. This kind of helps the argument out. If the opposite of this were true, like if you needed meat to survive, then consuming meat would probably still be ethical, even if it were not the most efficient way to feed everybody, because you need it, you know? But C helps the argument in its current iteration. It makes it sound like a non-meat diet can be pretty healthy. D says we're losing good farmland near cities to suburbs, but we could reverse this by just everybody living in the cities. That's not really relevant to whether eating meat is ethical or not. And so I know E is really tempting. It says nutritionists agree that a diet of just grain is not good for your health. So the point here is that it's saying that you need something else to be healthy. Now the problem with this is it's not saying that you need meat, right? The mistake, if you liked answer choice E, you're operating on this false assumption that the only two dietary components are grain and meat. So like if this isn't enough to be healthy, then we must need this for health, and therefore it's ethically okay to eat it. But that's not the case, right? Because there's vegetables. Vegetables aren't grains and they aren't meat. So what if grains and vegetables is enough to make you healthy? If that's true, then you don't need to eat meat. And there's other things besides grains and vegetables too. There's like legumes, like beans. There are probably other things that I'm not aware of. There's dairy, right? And so the problem with answer choice E is just because grain by itself isn't enough to keep you healthy, doesn't mean that you need to eat meat. There are other dietary components that you could probably add to make you healthy. You have to make an assumption to help E do its job. And with strengthen and weaken questions, you don't want to have to make assumptions to help the answer choice do its job. So B does its job directly. It attacks this assumption. We don't need to make any favorable assumptions of our own to help B weaken the argument. And so that's why it's the best answer.